Welcome to CEVAW Conversations, a podcast by the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. I'm Siân Human, the Knowledge Translation Coordinator at CEVAW. A little over 50 years ago, the first Australian women's refuge opened in Sydney. At the time, there was no legislation naming domestic violence as a crime. Police were largely treating it as a private matter that they didn't get involved with, and the people doing the work were mostly volunteers, running on conviction, and not much else. Today, we have national plans, specialist police units, landmark legislation, and a sector of hundreds of organisations. The conversation has changed, public awareness has changed, and yet demand continues to outpace resources, plans continue to outpace implementation, and the gap between what the evidence tells us works and what actually happens on the ground remains stubbornly wide. In this episode, I'm exploring that gap and the progress that has happened in the meantime, with two guests who have watched this sector evolve from very different vantage points. Delia Donovan is the CEO of Domestic Violence New South Wales, the peak body representing over 200 specialist services across the state. She has spent her career in the service system, advocating for the people it serves and the organisations doing the work. Dr Vincent Hurley is a lecturer in criminology at Macquarie University and spent nearly 3 decades as a police officer in New South Wales, including time as a detective, a hostage negotiator, and a senior figure on domestic violence policy and practice reform. Together, we're going to move through 3 questions. Where did the sector start? What has genuinely shifted? And what remains unfinished? To understand where we are, it helps to understand where we began. In the early 1970s, domestic violence wasn't a term in common use. It wasn't being recorded by police. It wasn't being funded by government. It was, for most of society, invisible.
I'm Delia Donovan. I'm the CEO of Domestic Violence New South Wales. I know we had an incredible women's refuge movement here in the 70s where, we had like powerhouse social justice advocates making sure there was somewhere for a woman and her children to go. And I know that certainly in New South Wales, we had the first refuge that opened in 1974. There was the Sydney Rape Crisis Centre, the first Women's Community Health Centre back then in 1974. And actually Domestic Violence New South Wales, the peak body where I work right now, was born out of the refuge movement. We know back then that domestic violence wasn't really discussed. Police certainly weren't recording it or understanding it. It was kind of seen as a private issue, really minimised and kind of invisible, which was not okay. Again, those social justice advocates really made sure it was kind of seen, heard, and that there was protection for, women and children fleeing. And I guess then in the 90s and over the noughties, we saw a lot of expansion of the sector, but we did see some defunding here in New South Wales with reforms that kind of took half the refuge sector out, which we still suffer from right now. So I guess there was kind of the professionalising of the sector, because what the sector almost had to rely on at that point in the 90s and the noughties was kind of government funding. So it kind of became part of the system. And I guess there was then ongoing advocacy by those social justice advocates in the space to kind of protect the independence of domestic violence work, but also there was reliance on funding because it is kind of life-saving work and it should be funded by government. So there was that kind of tension starting to build, and that's the tightrope I walk every day, that, we've got to stay in the room with the decision makers, but we've got to make sure we hustle and we advocate and we're brave and we're courageous. And that's the tension that we manage as a peak. We've got the evidence base, so we kind of have to kind of navigate these very tricky relationships day on day.
While advocates were establishing refuges and fighting for the sector to be recognised, police were also encountering domestic violence on virtually every shift. What was that world like from the inside? Dr Vincent Hurley joined the New South Wales Police in the early 1980s, starting his career in Mount Druitt in Sydney's outer western suburbs. What he describes about the culture he entered is confronting, but it matters, because understanding where policing started is part of understanding how far it has travelled.
The police culture is an amazing beast. Some people would see it mainly in the negative light, but there's lots of positives to it. And, when I joined back in 1981 at Mount Druitt, I left the academy after 12 weeks training, which now you think, oh my God, that's hardly anything. But at the time, that was what the expectation was, and that were the parameters that were set by the government. But I went to Mount Druitt, and even though I lived out Sydney's outer western suburbs and still do, it was a mindset of we never went to work, we went to war. So immediately we had this mindset within the police, and this is 2 generations ago, that the public were never on our side, that they were always viewed that they were just scum of the earth, that they had little worth because coming from a middle-class family upbringing, very stable one, and a lot of the police would have had a very similar outlook, and very few police women. That was just the mindset, and I am ashamed to even admit it now that was my thinking, and it shouldn't have been, because I had mum and dad and my 4 brothers raised with a very strong moral compass, and that was never a part of my upbringing, but that was the strength of the police culture at the time.
So that's the starting point. A sector built by volunteers who had to fight for legitimacy, and a policing institution that hadn't yet reckoned with its own role. Over the following decades, both began to change, sometimes because the evidence demanded it, sometimes because a political moment made it possible, and often because people pushed the systems around them to change. Let's look at what changed in policing first, because the structural reforms Vince witnessed are a useful lens for understanding how change actually works in a large institution.
The introduction of the apprehended domestic violence orders, or personal protection orders as they might be called interstate. Really interesting that I was working at the time in the detective's office, and they were introduced on, I think it was a Sunday, and there was no training. There was no training for police, and we didn't know what they were, and we didn't really understand the impact. But I think initially the introduction of them sent a really good message to the offenders that there is a change in the criminal justice system and society, that now there is an expectation that you adhere to a degree or a frame of behaviour that previously was accepted, but you are now being held to account. I think over the decades now, and again, this is just my perspective on it, I think their impact has been really diluted. And I often think to myself, how can their potency be readjusted to 2026? I know when they're introduced, they were really quite powerful. Another thing was certainly the New South Wales Police pro-arrest policy. So the pro-arrest policy came in 1998, 1999, something around that. And what was interesting about that is that there was an expectation of the organisation to go out and arrest a person with some really scant evidence for violence against women and children, really scant. And that is still the case today. There is a pro-arrest policy. But what is really interesting about that policy, and it didn't dawn upon me at the time, was that policy does not override the criminal law. So with really scant evidence, you would arrest a shithead male for committing violence, but if that was applied to another situation, you wouldn't arrest that person because there was insufficient evidence. And the courts have been happy to accept that there is the police policy because of social expectation. Another thing I think is important, because I did a little bit of time down at the Police Academy in Goulburn, lecturing on the detectives course, teaching detectives, and part of that job description was also to talk to recruits about the reality of policing. Certainly the introduction of tertiary educators, university lecturers within the police to educate the police on victimology and wider social issues like the impact of drugs, things like that is really important. So the police training generally, in New South Wales, it's broken up into 2 strands. It's got a university component, and they go down and they lecture the police on the sociology, the social aspects of society, where the police teach them about weapons training, OC spray, how to shoot, firearms training, baton training, all that technical policing day-to-day stuff. So the introduction of the university aspect of it, I think, has really been important. And I'm the first to put my hand up and say that when the New South Wales Police suggested that probably 20 years ago, I said, that's going to be fucked. It's going to ruin the organisation. But now I'm fully supportive of it. It's good that they get a different perspective. Absolutely.
Speaking of different perspectives, while policing was being reshaped from within, the broader public conversation about domestic violence was also shifting. Delia Donovan picks up that story, and the turning points she names changed the sector in ways that would have been hard to imagine 30 years earlier.
I kind of walked into a conversation about domestic violence. And I'd worked in domestic violence, of course, back in the UK. And I kind of heard, oh, this wasn't discussed before. The incredible Rosie Batty with her absolutely tragic situation with her son, Luke, and the murdering of him. I need to call it for what it was. Being put on the stage as the Australian of the Year kind of made me come here from a trauma-informed perspective and go, goodness me, this is incredible what this person's doing, and the grief they're moving through for the greater good and the vulnerability that's placed on them is absolutely unimaginable. But what Rosie did was absolutely transformational in terms of creating a conversation, and it became much more national. And there's been much more conversation around prevention. What's effective prevention and what does that look like? And certainly, I guess, over the last 10 years from a New South Wales context, we've looked at the refuge model, and we've kind of got the core and cluster refuge model, embedded from 2021. But that's not to say that the old refuge model doesn't work, because I've come from therapeutic communities where sometimes living in an environment, in a community, when you just come out of something really abusive, it's actually really key to maybe have that community around you. But the core and cluster refuge model also meets making sure that those self-contained units and there's that kind of wraparound support. And some clients, victim survivors, need that support, but having the variety is key. We've also kind of seen significant expansion of something called staying home, leaving violence, which kind of flips that old rhetoric around, women and children must flee, but instead giving them the kind of support within the house to stay safe, like providing security and support there, and that the perpetrator is obviously removed. A big kind of thing that we saw here when Labor came in New South Wales was the emergency funding package, which was significant at the time because it kind of expanded services across the state. Again, it didn't kind of look at the baseline funding, which I'm still screaming about because that's a big issue for our sector, but it did expand geographical kind of responses and services, and that was really key. The children's specialist workers were embedded back into the system, and it gave, I guess it respected the sector in terms of making it feel seen and heard for what it was doing and kind of making sure there was more services on the ground. Another thing I think I'd mention as well, Siân, is the conversation moving from that incident-based view of domestic violence to the pattern. And with that in mind, the coercive control legislation, and that was made an offence in July 2024, and it's kind of enabled a conversation across the community, across police, courts, services, and really made us think about, actually coercive control underpins all domestic violence, but let's talk about what domestic violence looks like, and it's not the physical. And of course, that's as significant, but we talk much more about the other forms of abuse, the emotional, the psychological, and there's more of an understanding of, why doesn't she leave? It's like, hang on, well, first of all, why did he hurt her? There's so many complex situations, all these different kind of barriers that I think we can somehow misunderstand, because I think if we look at kind of what we've been reading, what we see, what we're conditioned by in terms of news and papers, there's always that victim blaming language. So everyone's kind of coerced into that too. So there's a lot of kind of judgment on victim survivors. And I think that's shifting to some extent now. We are seeing a change with the media, and I think there's much more informed and thoughtful media happening. But yes, certainly the coercive control discussion's been very live and important. We're seeing some improvements around evidence and accountability in the system, which I think is ongoing work. And there are, real progress around system coordination and governance around, things like we've got here, the safety action meetings now, where everyone comes together in the one room to talk about how they're going to reduce risk for someone surviving domestic and family violence. And kind of final couple of bits, I guess, is here in New South Wales, we had our first Women's Safety Commissioner announced in December 2022. And with that came a domestic and family violence plan, which ends in 27. So the conversation's changing. I think the kind of coordination is still definitely needed, but there's much more of a conversation around that evidence and accountability and kind of government stepping up and leaning in more.
Running through both of these conversations is a thread that will be familiar to anyone working in this space: the distance between knowing what works and making it work at scale. It shows up in policy, in policing, in prevention funding. The evidence base has grown enormously over 50 years. The question is, what does it actually take to act on it?
So what happens when a new piece of legislation comes in, like coercive control? The legislation is then given to the police, the education services at the academy in Goulburn, take that legislation, and they will then apply what practical policing applies to that. Like, and the powers of arrest, what caution you should give an offender, how you should treat the victim, what questions to ask around this new law of coercive control, what evidence to look for, which is mainly, electronic or cyber in the case of coercive control because it's rarely physical. Then they'll take that information. Sometimes they'll send that back out to NGOs and other organisations and say, this is what our training package would look like. Do you want to comment on that? The education services go, oh, well, we never thought of that point. They'll adjust it, send it back to legal services. Does this still comply with the law? Yes, it does. Then they'll structure a training package and send it out. That could take 6 to 12 months. Then you've got 16,000 police to educate. And for every one police officer you see on the street, there are another 6 that are needed in the background for that individual to be working. So to then educate a workforce of 16,000, it takes a long time. Like, I'm not talking just months. It takes a long time. So then the police go, oh, wow, this is new. I've heard about coercive control legislation. There might be a little bit of a fact sheet given out to the police beforehand, but they still might not have their mind around it. So it's really long and complex process. It's not just, here's a new law, off you go. But it's not only just that law. I mean, there could be alcohol new laws. There could be laws on firearms. There's hundreds of new laws that the police have to implement, and some of them don't get any training package at all.
And it's not just the complexity of translating one law into practice. Vince has a wider point about where domestic violence sits within the full spectrum of what police are being asked to do.
If you can imagine walking out at night and looking up into the sky, you see 1 million stars. And those million stars represent everything the police have to do, whether it be for domestic violence, whether it be for hate crime, whether it be for youth crime, whether it be for fatal motor vehicle accidents, whether it be for people shoplifting, whether it be for pub blues, whether it be for stabbings, whether it be for cybercrime, whether it be for et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The police have got a load of stuff to do, but for you and me now, I'm only focused on one star, the domestic violence star. And that's all I want them to do. I become incredibly frustrated because I'm sure thousands of people around this country, like people at CEVAW and any organisation, why aren't the police doing something about it? There are millions of obligations the police have to do. And we are impatient because we're passionate about trying to deal with this problem.
So there's a gap between a law on paper and a police officer on the ground who understands it and can apply it. And it can take the better part of a year just to get a training package in place, let alone for that training to reach an entire workforce. Delia sees a version of the same gap playing out in the service sector, not in training pipelines, but in plans. Plans that exist, plans that are good, plans that aren't being funded or implemented.
Actually, we have all the plans, we have all the solutions, we're just not actually funding them, and we're not being accountable to those plans. New South Wales has about 7 or 8 plans, that actually need to be enacted: a prevention plan, a domestic and family violence plan, a sexual violence plan. I could name, the Aboriginal standalone domestic and family violence plan. The biggest barrier is short-term funding cycles. And if I give you the context of New South Wales, our domestic and family violence sector have not had an increase to their baseline in over 10 years. And if we think about our own electricity bill, wage bill, insurance premiums, and we're seeing, we released a report that's seen in the last year the workforce shrink by 12%. And the workforce shrinks not because they're not there, because, people trying to run the organisation can't fund everyone anymore because the costs are so great to run an organisation. But the baseline funding hasn't been increased. So we're really calling on our government right now for 177 million in the next state budget to ensure that frontline organisations have a 50% increase to their core funding. And that's 177 million. And that's 0.1% of the current state budget. I think another frustrating reality probably is the workforce strain and burnout because of the high demand, because obviously we don't have a sustainable situation with funding. So we are actually impacting the front line. And, we've been saying recently, goodwill is not a funding model, but we know everyone who works in this space goes above and beyond in their own time if they have to. And I think that takes its toll, and it means that we'll lose brilliant people because they end up feeling burned out because there's that constant demand that we know isn't going anywhere. And I guess the system complexity continues to undermine good practice. So we know that a lot of services are kind of operating across multiple funding streams, different reporting frameworks, different referral pathways, all those kind of different silos. And I think navigating that even as workers and even navigating it as a survivor is particularly strenuous and not ideal at all.
All of that fragmentation, the funding silos, the reporting frameworks, the referral pathways, points to a system that has grown out of necessity rather than being properly designed. I asked Delia what it would actually look like to shift it from crisis management towards genuine prevention.
And this is such an important question, Sian, and I think not an easy answer, because I kind of can't sit here and say, we need to move to prevention, because I think it's almost no one wants to hear that kind of long term. How long is prevention? How long is it going to take to get us all safer and, the world a safer place? And we know we're navigating some very interesting world politics right now and seeing some really harmful behaviours played out by very powerful people that are not being held accountable. But I think we have to acknowledge that prevention and crisis have to be working together, and they're in tandem. They're not isolated by any stretch, and they can't be funded in isolation. And I think prevention's key. And here in New South Wales, the government announced its first prevention plan, Pathways to Prevention, it was called, and that was announced in October 2024. It ends in 28. 38 million was assigned over those 4 years. We had advocated for 100. Again, we're not funding it properly. So it's great we've got the first plan. It's really key that we've got that. And it kind of speaks a bit about kind of getting into those priority areas like schools and workplaces and sporting codes. There's another kind of area of the plan that's around supporting Aboriginal-led prevention and self-determination. And then there's that third area that's about kind of the governance and building the evidence, which is kind of where we come in as a peak. So really pleased to see that prevention plan in place. But I think we often have to navigate conversations where people say, oh, look, we funded 38 million. You've got a 4-year plan. Where are your wins? And it's like, look, the wins are going to be long term because we haven't invested in this for, again, a long time. And actually, you're not resourcing the front line, because if you don't resource the front line, prevention can't happen anyway, because they still have to manage the crisis day in, day out. That doesn't go anywhere right now. So we want to see a bit more of a whole community kind of prevention, early intervention, all the way through to recovery. Kind of, we need to see a much more thorough end-to-end plan and not see prevention as a kind of shiny new thing that's going to change the world. Because yes, we need prevention, and that needs to be first and foremost and embedded into everything we do, but not without managing the crisis as well at the same time and ensuring it's funded. So yeah, kind of breaking down the silos across those different areas is going to be key there too.
The frustration Delia is describing is systemic. The knowledge exists, the plans exist, but the will to act on them by funding them sufficiently just does not. Vince arrives at a similar place, but from a different direction. His frustration is with what happens when knowledge never reaches the people it needs to reach at all.
I get frustrated trying to address, the violence or to try and make a dent into this area of violence against women and children. And the reason I get frustrated is that because there are millions of articles, millions of reports around the world, probably tens of millions, and organisations, and I'm not being critical, organisations churn out papers and academics churn out paper. Research does go to inform policy, and policy does go to shape social expectations and reflect society. So there's nothing wrong with that. But while these people are pumping out these articles, I think who's actually out there talking to the boys or young kids to change their attitudes, to change their views? Every time I hear of a new inquiry into this area, yes, it is so complex. Yes, it is evolving. I think who is actually out there talking to these kids to try and change their behaviour? And I think while people are sitting down and writing articles, and yes, it informs policy, and yes, it goes to shape society, and yes, it gives us a better way, hopefully, to address violence against women and children. But whilst that is occurring, what's happening in the meantime? But you're not going to get a 14, 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old boy who's got these austere attitude towards women. They're not going to fucking read a single article. from Google Scholar. They're not going to pick up a report. It's not their world. So how do you get through to them? How do you teach someone who's 14 to 18? Because we often talk about men, but of course we all know it starts much earlier than that. How do we get to them to cope better with rejection? I mean, I've spoken to probably 3,000, maybe over 3,000 school children in the Greater Sydney metropolitan area. And when teachers email me, a lot of them just cold email me, and one of their concerns is the cost. So you've got organisations, and I'm not being critical of the organisations because they need money to survive. You know, they're charities, but a lot of schools that I've spoken to, mainly in Sydney's western suburbs and southwestern suburbs, and the kids are sitting on chairs moulded with plastic, made in the 1980s. You walk into a hall and the paint's peeling off the walls. And these schools, primarily state schools, do not have the money to pay thousands and thousands for an organisation. And I'm not being critical. This is just Vince Hurley. They don't have the money to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for a program that will help the kids. I went to a school in southwestern Sydney a few months ago, and the teacher said, and I'm not going to say the school because the teachers might know, they wanted me to be incredibly blunt with the kids. The teacher didn't say go and drop the F-bomb, but I read between the lines that you had to be blunt to cut through to the board. Now, people will say, well, you know, that may not work, or that didn't work, or you should have been more nuanced, or you should have been that. But that's not coming from me. That came from the teachers, and they know that cohort. They know the attitudes of the boys. They're not boys, they're young men. They know that. And then people will say, well, and as other people have said to me, well, how do you measure your success if you only is a one-off? You're not going to really make a dent in the views and attitudes.
Across both of these conversations, there is a particular quality of frustration. The frustration of people who can see exactly what needs to happen and are watching the gap between the evidence and the action remain stubbornly wide. But it sits alongside something else. Neither of these guests have given up. I asked both of them what gives them a reason to keep going.
Conversations like this, Siân, give me hope. Spreading our messages out and about, getting to work with the most incredible staff team that I do every day at DV New South Wales, representing the most amazing organisations on the ground here in New South Wales, that we know there's life-saving work happening, there's prevention happening, there's, you know, brilliant people going above and beyond every day to ensure that, you know, women and children are safeguarded from this. Those national allies, brilliant people driving change. And I guess even the public conversation's changing. I'm seeing some incredible role models on their socials, and, you know, there's some great kind of male conversations happening more now, and they do count and they are important because, you know, we often say men and boys, we've got to educate them, we've got to do this. And it's like, we need to teach men and boys to love themselves, to respect themselves. That's the first part of the conversation for me before we start talking about everything else. And I think trying to have that conversation carefully, where we've got to have accountability and safety and call out anything that's toxic, but make sure we're not kind of missing those that we really could engage, because the conversation goes one way or another. There are some really robust conversations happening, and the sector is being certainly recognised for its work more than it was, I think, prior. So we need to mobilise those opening doors and really push through them and make sure the sector's respected and funded as it needs to be. And yeah, I think the growing community awareness is also key, because that will enable people to reach out for help. We know so much of domestic and family violence is underreported. But again, when people reach out for help, it's important that the services are funded properly to be able to, you know, engage in the best possible way. But, you know, fingers crossed on the next state budget. I remain, as a social worker, a hopeless believer, and I won't change that. And I think hope is so important. And I know some people go, oh God, I don't like the word hope, and it's, you know, flowery or whatever, but it's like, gosh, that keeps me going every day. Hope in humanity is all I got right now.
You know, I'm sure that 3,000 school boys or girls that I've spoken to, you know, probably 80% wouldn't even, their eyes probably glazed over. but you don't want to lose those individuals that are on the fringe that you might be able to change. That's really important. And again, I often think to myself, I'm not trying to change the world. I'm just trying to change one person at a time.
So 50 years on from the first refuge, the sector has a language, a legislative framework, and a body of evidence it didn't have before. But as both Delia and Vince make clear, knowing what works and making it work are not the same thing. And the distance between them is still where most of the hardest work happens. Thank you to Delia Donovan and Dr Vincent Hurley for their time and their honesty, and for remaining hopeful about change. I'm Siân Human. Thanks for listening to CEVAW Conversations. This podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge their continuing deep connection to country. We also recognise the many diverse traditional custodians across Australia and extend our respect to all Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and other Indigenous peoples around the world. This podcast was produced by Siân Human and Greta Robinstone for the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Elimination of Violence Against Women.